Welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast, a podcast hosted by Marcelo Aevi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium. We aim to draw a map of the state of criminology across Europe through the words of contemporary criminologists. How is criminology defined and taught? Which are the main lines of research? Which are the main schools of thought in each country? These and many other questions are answered here by fellow researchers who share their vision on the development of criminology in their countries from its beginnings to the second decade of the 21st century. If you want to know and compare their stories, stay tuned.
Today we are interviewing Professor Per-Olof Wikström. Per-Olof Wikström is Professor of Ecological and Developmental Criminology at the Institute of Criminology, University of Cambridge. He is the Director of the Center for Analytic Criminology. This interview was conducted on 20 May 2022. Today we are interviewing Professor Per-Olof Wikström, Cambridge University, Professor of Ecological and Developmental Criminology at the Institute of Criminology. He is the Director of the Center for Analytic Criminology and is probably known very good as the principal investigator of the PETS Plus study, a longitudinal study, which is basically used to test criminological theories and especially situational action theory. So we welcome you, Professor Wikström. We would like to start this podcast by asking you to try to define criminology in your own words as it exists in the country you work or the countries you have been working in your case, that may be the UK and or Sweden, of course.
Okay, well, I think when you define criminology, I always thought that it's actually two main strands. You have criminology as interested in the causes of crimes and so on, and then you have criminal justice, which is perhaps the dominating form. People are interested in prisons, criminal justice systems, and so on. And these are quite divided in a sense. And I think it's fair to say that criminology, both in the UK and in Sweden, is actually dominated of criminal justice studies. The interest for what to say, fundamental research and about the basic causes of crimes and so on is less prevalent in a sense. And one reason for that might be that it's much easier to get funding to do studies of if you want to study prison, you want to study police and so on, than if you want to do that. But I'm not sure about that. So obviously criminology has to do is an applied science, which makes it also a bit more tricky because it's defined from the outcome we study. So there are I mean, if you think that people who actually work in criminology, that there's one group, but there's a lot of people who, economists, psychologists, and so on, who do studies in criminology. So I guess when we talk about interest in causation and so on, it might actually be greater in other areas like sociology and psychology and so on. So, for instance, if I take one example in Sweden, the University of Örebro has been running a lot of studies on that for a long time, where they have been sort of interested in what they call antisocial behavior and crime and so on. And obviously also in the UK, I mean, you can think about, let's say, Moffat's study, the E-risk study, which also is the Michael Rutter. There's a lot of people. So criminology is hard to define as a distinct discipline. It's as I said, it's mostly defined by an interest for a particular topic. But again, I think there is a divide in the interest in the topic in terms of the criminal justice interest and the interest for, what would you say, patterns and causes of crime on the one and the other hand. And the former is obviously more prevalent.
Yeah, this divide is especially visible in Europe and is less visible in the United States. Would there be a particular reason, historically speaking, for this divide? I don't know, but I have the impression that there are, at least in continental Europe, many criminology departments arose out of the criminal law departments and law faculties, and not the social sciences. Has this had some impact?
Yeah, no, I think from Sweden, as I understand it, it's mainly came from law and from psychiatry. The initial interest in, and often that might explain the criminal justice interest. There were a lot of people who were lawyers who was interested in reforming the criminal justice systems and so on, and went into. And I think the first professor in criminology in Sweden was Knut Sverre, who was a lawyer from Norway, who came and took up the first chair in criminology and so on. So it's quite remarkable. I agree that the difference between the US, where it's heavily dominated by sociology and to some extent psychology, as we can see from a lot of the various. So I think the emergence in, as you say, in Europe is very different from what it was in the US. If you think back to the Chicago school and things like that, which started off the things, and compare it in with the European situation.
I can understand this. That's mainly because of the fact that lawyers and so on are interested in social reform, that they take on the criminal justice practice. However, it's a bit of a pity because you cannot really change behavior or improve person situations without understanding what drives their behavior. So it's worth a reflection, I think.
Yeah.
So can you tell us something about the institutionalization of criminology? I mean, by institutionalization, the institutes and the educational programs which exist. For example, the Flemish part of Belgium, we have bachelor programs, master programs, and PhD programs. Can you expand a little bit on that in the UK or Sweden?
When I used to work in Sweden, I worked at Stockholm, which was the first criminology department that was set up. When I was there, it was the only criminological department. And now there are plenty popping up. It's quite interesting, I think, that criminology is such a popular topic among students, given that the labor market is not that obvious if you do criminology. I mean, the same situation with now when I'm in Cambridge. Cambridge was the first department also in the UK, and now there's a lot of departments in the UK, so it has expanded. There's a lot of undergraduate programs in criminology. What is different, I guess, with Cambridge is that we do not run any specific undergraduate programs. The institute provides some undergraduate teaching for sociology and law, but no, we don't have our own undergraduate. It's mostly postgraduate institute, and has been, yeah. But I think there are some pressure for the institute to move towards doing more undergraduate teaching. I mean, if we compare with the Swedish situation, criminology was not an independent topic from the beginning. It was also it was actually at times part of sociology. So when I did that, I had to do my PhD training in sociology, and then eventually it became its own department with its own exam rights later on, and developed But it looks like criminology actually overtakes sociology in terms of student interests and so on, which is quite interesting in that sense. So yeah, criminology is, as you know, is expanding and has expanding for the about 40 plus years I've been working in this. Has expanded from quite a few institutes now to be sort of enormous lot of most universities seems to have some kind of criminology programs and so on. But also again, a lot of the programs are focused on criminal justice issues. If you look at various.
So basically, at the level of educational programs, you also see this divide between criminology and criminal justice. Do you think it has advantages to have undergraduate programs, because criminology is by definition multidisciplinary? So if you organize graduate programs, you can take in students with different backgrounds. But I mean, you have, of course, to invest in an undergraduate program. Personally, I think having to deal with both is quite a challenge. And I would personally to invest in postgraduate students, because if you have to start from scratch, you invest a lot in what you say, an increasing number of people. Indeed, there's an increasing number of persons. I think this is a general trend. I don't know, Marcelo, how the situation is in Switzerland, but the increasing numbers, indeed, it poses a lot of challenges.
Yeah, well, you can see some problems. I mean, in Cambridge, since we don't have an undergraduate program, the students we get them, some of the students has done undergraduates in criminology, some students have done religion, or they have done whatever subject, and so on, which is a bit of a challenge, I guess, from a teaching perspective, because some people have zero knowledge about criminology and some have quite advanced. So that's and since we don't have any requirement that people have to have a criminology undergraduate degree to start, which I think some other places may have, that you actually have to have a degree if you're going to do postgraduate studies in that sense. Which is then again very different from Sweden, where you obviously need to have an undergraduate degree to continue to do postgraduate studies.
So it has an impact, especially. I mean, I can imagine that there's a big difference between programs who only have a postgraduate versus undergraduate level with regard to knowledge of criminological theories. Some people have zero background. I have to start from scratch, when other people have their knowledge and have been trained also in specific methods, for example.
Yeah, that's another interesting issue, because a lot of criminology, I mean, not all places, but a lot of criminology is you could say tilted or focused on qualitative studies. So that also means that if you recruit people from other disciplines, primarily psychology, they are normally quite good in sort of stats methods and things like that, while many people who come not from all, but from some criminological department. So that's again, I guess, another challenge when you have this system that people have very different backgrounds, both in substantive knowledge and as comes to what kind of methods. Although personally, I think there is really no difference between qualitative and quantitative studies. I think there's an artificial divide, because we really should talk about what methods are good for what kind of research topics. So now this is an interesting trend also, I think, because it has become so we are qualitative researchers and we are judged from one set of criteria of our research, and we are quantitative and judged from a whole other. You really want to have a situation, or ideally, where you judge all research in terms of quality from the same standards and so on. But it is kind of fits also in, I guess, with different ideologies in terms of what research is and so on. But that is, I guess, in general in criminology, quite interesting and big problems and so on, and some that generate some conflicts. and between people and so on, in terms of what is knowledge, what is real knowledge. And I mean, you have this expression now that people have very popular with lived experience, which has popped up now, that one say that you really cannot know anything if you haven't sort of experienced it yourself, which is sort of very different from other methods and so on. So there's tension between these two that is around.
Are there any ways of solving these problems as a consequence of these tensions, or should be more room for an open dialogue, or has this become impossible in the current climate?
I think it's difficult in some senses, because I mean, if you're trained, it's almost like two paradigms or two major paradigms. So you're trained in how you think about it, what is knowledge, what is sort of good methods, and so on. I don't think it's good for criminology, because give you an example, I had a talk for some years ago in a suburb to Stockholm, to sort of local crime prevention. Then I talked about causes of crime, and then a guy came up to me and said, okay, you say like this, then we invite another criminologist and he says something different. So in terms of for people who work in practice and policy, I mean, that's pretty complicated, because I guess in contrast to some other more, what you say, solid sciences, that how should they assess which are sort of the more fundamental or more strong evidence and so on. But as we know, and it is complicated, and then we have the additional dimension that is also quite strong ideological impacts on people's choice of things and ideas and so on. It's a complicated field, and partly quite political, I think. I don't know what you think, but you feel that it's not only about sort of the evidence and the ideas, it's also about ideologies are important. And obviously ideologies are important in terms of how do you deal with people who do crime, what things should be criminalized. But when it comes to the causes of crimes, I struggle a bit more to think that it's a political dimension. So the causes could be different for people depending on what kind of background they have. But there is, I think, that tendency that people, depending on how they're leaning politically, tends to favor certain kinds of. And I guess that is more pronounced in Europe than in the US. I'll be sure that there is more sort of, what do you think, more disagreements about what is going on there?
Well, maybe I think the political dimension really is important when you want to understand why some people prefer some kind of interventions, rehabilitation versus prevention initiatives. But it's also a huge problem that there is a lack of distinction between actual causes and more distal causes. So people favoring, for example, social prevention, stress, social problems, and, for example, ecological concentrations of poverty as major causes, which I do not think they are unimportant, but they need to put an integrated framework. And it's the issue of integration, and people who think too ideologically tend to focus either too much on the environment or too much on the individual actor. And this is where things go wrong. I mean, there's a difference, between trying to understand something, even while crime is a social construction, between brackets, if you talk about what is criminalized, of course, but the actual behavior is behavior which harms. So I think this distinction situation has been better some 20 years ago when there was an open dialogue, but I have the feeling that the struggles, like the political situation in the 1970s, has come back, but not in the same way. But the same ideological contradictions are just re-emerging under the influence of what one might call what some people call woke movements, and the extremes of this movement. While I'm not saying that it's unimportant to address these problems, it's just the way you deal with it or you overreact. I think we have huge issues to think about, but I wouldn't know how to bring scholars together to have a constructive dialogue and to improve the situation for criminologists.
Yeah, perhaps Pio, you can help us here because you were there. You are one of the founders of the European Society of Criminology.
Yeah.
I have the impression that the generation that founded the society was very open to empirical research.
Yeah.
When you look at the names and the projects that were there, the International Crime Victim Survey, the International Self-Reported Delinquency Study, the European Source Book. Nowadays, I have the impression when we want to recruit new people for the European Source Book, it is not so easy to find that.
Yeah, no, it is. I remember very well. I mean, I think when it started, I met Jussin Jungertas in Stockholm. Then what I think was the first we talked about doing, and then I think the Dutch took care of that, and then Michael came in and took over and fixed it up. So, but at that time, at least the idea with the European Society was, well, the idea was that there is a lot of good research in Europe. There's a lot of national criminological association, and most people went to the US, to the ASC. So if you wanted to hear something about other European research, you have to go to the ASC basically, and so on. But it also was, I think, the idea to foster sort of European criminology, because there is a tendency, I think, in Europe to think about the US as the measure for everything good in terms of, I mean, I'm obviously, as you might have no negativity against American criminology. I've been doing a lot, but I think there is a problem that, give you a good illustration. One of the ESC conferences, we had a meeting, I think, which was supposed to include Michael Gottfriedson and 3 other Europeans, and the room was full. There were hundreds of people, and then someone came and say, well, unfortunately Michael Gottfriedson couldn't come, and then basically most of the people stood up and walked out, and the 2 Europeans who were left, which in one sense is quite rude, I think, but it shows you, it illustrates some point, and my understanding is also, I might be wrong about this, but often that when the European organizers, that they often like to have an American as keynote speakers. The whole idea with the European Society was actually to foster European criminology and so on. I think that's quite important. I hope still that is something we can do better. I lost your question.
The ESC, we also the idea is not to have more than one speaker from the US. There is this idea, but my impression is that there is a change of generation. That there was a generation that was very empirical, and some people criticized the ESC because it was very empirical. And now, with all this explosion of institutes, you have, of course, different trends. Ideology is taking a lot of space in these new debates, in the current debates.
I think you're right in the sense that the people who started the European Society was empirically oriented researchers. It was dominated by empirically oriented researchers. But slowly and surely, I think the European Society has recruited people from other places, so that's probably the reason why it changed, and the expansion of the changed face a bit. But I agree with you. In some sense, it was more perhaps homogeneous from the beginning, and now it's more heterogeneous in so on, and in terms of that. So and one can obviously discuss to what extent that is good and bad, but in terms of development, but it has expanded quite a lot from the early days and so on.
The idea was to have an inclusive society, everyone could talk, but I have the impression that now it is much more difficult to find people willing to coordinate a network across Europe, like the International Crime Victim Survey, which we launched, we tried to relaunch. It was not so easy. perhaps it's also the way in which positions are being offered now, and then you have to publish, and you have to publish in some journals, and get some, and perhaps these huge European projects in the long term, require a lot of work, and you cannot get so many publications as you wish. I don't know. I feel that there is a change.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think it's a disaster, this published parish, because I mean, if you think about it, if people have published a lot of articles on piecemeal pieces, we have the people I worked with, we always worked for doing sort of bigger, longer projects. As you know, the latest book we do now, which hopefully will come out this year, it took us 7 years. And we worked with that for 7 years, and so on. And that you can do obviously if you have a permanent position, and so on. And well, you have to publish obviously with something, but it's easier. But if you're a young scholar, it's problematic. But the idea of doing small slices like this, I think, contributes to this fragmentation of knowledge. Because obviously, I mean, as we said before, you have people, and you have the situations, and you have macro. If you want to try to understand how it works, you need to combine the two, and then you cannot do that in a small article. One publisher we used, they're going to stop doing paperbacks now, so I guess soon it's going to be, it gets more and more difficult to do monographs. The trend that I guess taken from science is that we should do PhD thesis by papers. I also think is a bit counterproductive, because doing it as a book gives you sort of a more holistic way of working, and then to do small articles and then write a summary of them. And you can understand why they do that in sciences. I'm not so sure that it's beneficial for our discipline.
Do you mean criminology or social sciences in general?
Well, it depends a bit on what you think about, but I mean, generally, I think it depends. Again, I can think of some exceptions where it's useful to do that. But if we stick to criminology, I think it's probably not an entirely positive. I mean, there's always exception, but that could be good if you really have a research program where and then you publish the things. But then you could as well do it as a book in the first place, and so on. And it also means when you do a thesis that if you already published the things, it's not much new in the thesis.
I think it's quite interesting what you're saying. In connection with what you said, what the difference may be, in my opinion, is that many of the American theories of the 20th century are, I would say, grounded basis. Like here she told me, I got the data, I was trying to test anomy theory, and then I discovered it did not fit, so I developed a new theory. In your case, you spend a lot of time, as you mentioned, reading philosophy. So maybe this is the good time. I wonder how did you arrive, for example, to Mario Bunge?
Okay, I can tell you exactly how that happened. I mean, the first part of my life, make my point, I basically did empirical studies. And I really think that there's a problem when young people start to do theories the first they do, because it's quite complicated, but that's a different point. But I had a break. I got a fellowship at the Stanford Advanced Center, and that gave me time. That's where I had time to just read and so on. And then I one day went down to the Stanford University bookshop, and then I walked around, and then I found a book by Mario Bunge, and I read it, and I thought, this is fantastic. This is
Which one?
And then I actually contacted him. So then I started to correspond with him, and then I met him. I went to see him in Canada, and then I also had him over for a conference. But he was also kind when I did writings about causations and so on, I sent stuff to him and asked for which. So And I think he's probably the most impressive scholar I ever met and talked. I'm extremely impressed. I mean, normally you don't easily get impressed, but Mario Bung he's in sort of a different. And so that's why it was by accident, by which I quite like, go around in the bookshop and look for things I haven't read before and so on. And then I find this, and then I got more and more and so on. And he was, I mean, as you know, that's what you hope. I mean, he became basically 100 years old and still wrote books in his 90s, one a year. It's amazing. So, yeah. But perhaps we should leave that. But I think the important thing is with that is that a lot of the inspiration for my work on SAT has come from other parts than criminology. Obviously, it takes in criminology in a sense, because some people said to me it's another routine activities theory, it's another control theory, it's another, which is quite good, because then it works, because it's people see different things. But I think that was the major sort of break, and I think reading a lot of action philosophy, which I did then, was sort of a main inspiration, because I felt we need something to tie together this individual and environmental. A lot of theories is just focused on psychological. I mean, risk factors is a typical example. You just list characteristics one after another, or you have environments, but you don't really know how it works. So the basic foundation is that if we want to understand how environments works, and so we need to understand how they affect people, because people are the people are the ones who do the crimes, and so on. So that's the simple. So that became the vehicle for bringing together sort of people and environments through that. So that was the background, I think.
I also am very much impressed by the work of Mario Bunge, especially the way he developed his thinking about causation. I think if people would read a lot more about philosophy of science and philosophy of causation, it would help their theorizing and their ideas to sharpen their ideas, because this way of analytic thinking in philosophy, which is so typical of Mario Bunge, really forces you to think of what makes something tick, what makes something happen. This foundational thinking about theories is just lacking in almost all criminology programs. So I think if you want to improve our future generations of criminologists, they should have this kind of courses before they get in touch with all the classic criminological theories. They should know something about basic philosophy of action, philosophy of causation, what causation is and what it isn't.
So I mean, following on from what Marcelo say, also that action theory is one thing. The other thing was unhappiness with risk factors, that it's really processes rather, and that links to what Lieven says with this causation. So because if you think you have a risk factor saying that if you live with a single parent, you're more likely, I looked at one study yesterday, more likely being that 20% who lived with the single parents compared to 9% who did crimes, but 80-90% in both cases did not. And then but the key thing is the process. Why would this, if you just ask the why and how questions more, I think that would be really helpful, because why would this be important? How does it work? That's I guess something that we talked about. Bung is really championing that the reason to understand the processes, and that also means, I think, that you can reduce the number of factors and so to a few basic processes that you're interested in, and that's makes life much easier. And then if you're interested in policy and prevention, these are the processes that one should try to affect in so on, instead of trying to, as you know, there are hundreds of risk factors. So if you're chasing risk factors and you develop program for them, I mean, it's almost hopeless in a sense. Just say one more thing on the things I think Lieven started also with. And also you can see when you work long time that people tends to reinvent the wheel and so on. So I was thinking, I make one observation there because I did a comment on a student for some pre-PhD comment who did on ecology, and then I noticed that there was not very much included in his work more than 20 years ago or whatever. And then I said, but there was a lot done in this particular country. I'm trying to be discreet here. Before that, and then he told me about, yeah, but you can't find it on the internet. So basically, it looks like some people stop going to libraries also. So if it's not digitized, then it doesn't exist, and that is a small but probably significant problems. It's very convenient, obviously, to be able to download everything and find articles, but all the stuff, you're probably going to miss a lot of all the stuff by doing that. So
Yeah, especially what you said about walking in. When I was studying, I paid my studies basically working in Switzerland, working in the library of Freiburg, Switzerland. So
yeah,
I was there, and when you smell the books and you go there, and sometimes it's very often you find things. Jorge Luis Borges, the writer, also was a fan of libraries and walking there, and you never know what can happen. A book is there waiting for you somehow, and this is, I force my students for one of the methodology, because a couple of at least one of the journals in French has not yet been digitalized, so I force them to look for articles on this journal. But this, I don't know how long it's going to work because they are now digitalizing it. So it's very difficult to force people to find a way of forcing them to go there and to get used to this exercise, because it is an exercise.
I think it's an interesting question I ask myself. Is it because I'm getting old that I think that you should really read books and so on? So it might be that if you grow up with sort of everything on the internet, that is but I find it very hard, let's say, to sit and read and lay in bed and read and having some kind of digital. You really want to feel the book and so on. And also, I think you read differently, but it might just be a generational thing but it would be pretty sad if the books were vanishing from things.
I agree. There's another advantage with books, I guess, that is, you also mentioned already the piecemeal information. You can tackle everything in one empirical article, but also if you trace the history of someone's PhD. I was, for example, at Ghent University, one of the last who was forced to write a book. Now we have the choice to write a book either or publish your PhD on articles. But in that case, there has to be one general line and a red thread. So no separate articles, but just one key question, and each chapter can be seen as a different article. But articles in general never give you the profoundness, and at least there's millions of articles being published right now. For me, my PhD was on social disorganization theory and neighborhood effects, which I integrated then with the previous version, the original version or the beginnings of situational action theory. And I felt that, when I read all these articles on social disorganization theory and I follow them now, it's like impossible to get an overview. So books are really important to give you the overview and meta analysis and so on, analysis and so on. I think if you're drowning in articles, it's not going to be very helpful in the future, because you can just...
That's a good way to get published or get a lot of quotations, do a meta systematic review, because since people basically likes not to have to do all the work themselves, so it seems to be very popular. But I guess that is also another good thing that is a bit problematic in terms of because you mix a lot of different quality stuff, and I know people try to take that into account. One good study could outperform 10 bad studies, but if you just join them, so it's I'm not sure that's always a tendency that is really helpful for knowledge gathering. But I say something on the books we said, because one thing I remember, especially from when I was a student and reading a famous French sociologist, and then if you have a book, I was reading on page 10, and then I was on page 50, I think, but he's contradicted himself, and then I could flick back to page 10 quickly, which is much harder if you do it on the net, and then flick back and see, is this really consistent, and so on. So there's a lot of good things with books, I think we probably agree on.
Another thing on articles, and the problems with articles is, I mean, you hear this discussion in other disciplines. I don't know to what extent it's being studied in criminology, but you hear, especially in psychology, the issue of the replication crisis and the fact that probably a lot of studies who report no results are not being published. I don't know to what extent one would expect this to be the case in criminology, but we don't have a clue, and the publication pressure will probably have an effect on this as well. So we might overestimate the empirical value of, for example, some theories who are tested a lot, like control theory or different versions of control theory, social learning theory. It's quite unclear.
But you have a problem there, Lieven says. One thing that people don't, which I find quite interesting, is when people test theory, it's rarely people have very good data for testing the theory. I mean, I think you mentioned social learning theory, and I think Aker said that there's so many studies who shows that peer delinquency is strongly connected, therefore they support social learning, but they can support hundreds of theories and so on. So in the sense, instead of doing sort of systematic reviews, just counting sort of the outcomes, it would also be quite good to have studies, and that's obviously much harder, to go through studies and actually check how well they actually test what they say they test. Because a lot of, I think when you see people just report, oh, this study didn't support that theory and so on, and then you go read it, but perhaps it didn't test the theory. and if you look at journal editors, I think this is, they spend enormous lot of, well, some of them on let's say the methods and so on, not so much on data. And as you know, garbage in, garbage out. There's rarely you see in the comments say, are your data really good? And so on. But then they can spend enormous lot of times on the coefficients and things like that, and the tests and measurements and so on. It's a problem, I think. And also I think I don't know what you think. Sometimes I think more simple analysis might be useful, because in the complex, if we do really complex methods, structural equation modelings, latent variables and so on, you in a sense risk to lose what's really going on. So just as an example, that's why part of the reason why it takes a long time to do the book we do, is that really checking cross table, go back to basics and see that there is really something going on. Because if you run these models even if they are significant, they could be sort of not very important findings and so on. So and that's probably is a problem for our field, that the criteria of importance, is this an important finding? Because as we know, a statistically significant finding might not be important at all.
So yeah, I agree, and maybe this has to do with the fact that we are, in a way, when we test theories, kind of like obliged to use statistical methods, because we cannot use experiments all the time, and we cannot only rely on qualitative methods. We need both. So the tendency to over control in quantitative studies, too many variables, some effects may disappear. Something important. You may have two variables which basically are related to the same construct. I think all this shows us that we, in criminology, when we test theories, we think too much in terms of just variables, and people are not a collection of variables, of course.
And also, I think it would be much help if we go back to the problem of risk factors, because people say that these factors affect this factor. What it normally shows is, let's say, if we take again the example with single parents, what it shows, it's more common that people who have a single parent has done crime. It doesn't show that it is an effect. So the more single parents you have, so to speak, because most people, it has no effect. So if we were talking about in that terms, rather than the effect of having a single parent, saying that it's more common, then it would perhaps help also theorizing a bit better.
Well, actually, a good point here, and maybe there is something that can be done, because I have the impression that sometimes these problems arise because of the way in which criminology is being taught. And many of the programs in Europe use American books, North American books from the USA. And you see in these books, the new theories are almost never there. For example, you cannot find easily clear reference to situational action theory. You cannot find reference to the works of Richard Tremblay, for example. So shouldn't, for example, you, Pio, with all that you know about theories, shouldn't we try to do something also like a book, a European handbook, which presents theories in a different way? Shouldn't we try to teach them differently?
Well, I think that's an excellent idea. I guess the only way to do it is on English. I mean, and as Lievens know, I'm working, have a project on doing a book of that way in Sweden. So we're halfway done, but that's in Swedish, which I will see, but which basically talks about not theories, but sort of ideas. How important is the person? How important, and then bringing in theories in that way, and so on. But I agree with you, and a project, sort of European project, might be quite good to do, and so on, and also perhaps focus a bit more on European research, and so on. That might be a good idea for the European Association to initiate in a sense. But I mean, I'm always scared with this project. It really requires then that people are prepared to spend a lot of time. So it just not becomes like people write disparate chapters on somewhere and they have no coordination and so on, because the whole idea would be to obviously to coordinate it and have it as a coherent. But that's quite a good idea, I think. It might even have get some odd person in the US interested in in something.
Even if you publish in Sweden, the Nordic countries have this policy of helping with the translation of the books to English.
Yeah,
because part of the success of these criminal books, the noir books, the books on crime by a lot of writers from the Nordic countries, one factor is that you can get them translate, and then it's much more easier to get the publication.
The only problem I think with that, Marcelo, is that I mean, if you do one specifically for Sweden, it's very specifically for Sweden. So I think if I were to do that project, one should really do. One can obviously capitalize a bit on the work done, but it should really be a new project rather than a translation. I think that will work better. So in this sense, I'm looking at your questions here. I don't know. We have a lot of interesting discussions, but we haven't covered much of your questions. But I don't know if that's.
We still need to cover the challenges, the key challenges for criminology as a discipline, and we need to talk about the policy influence.
Perhaps then we can talk a bit about challenges. We have talked about challenge. I mean, I guess this fragmentation is a kind of a challenge, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But I think since we talked about theory, that really, and that links into policy, because what I think you can see in policy is that they really lack guidance. They really lack guidance and basically answer the question, because if you want to prevent something, you need to know what to influence. And that basically means you need to have some idea what causes the problem, which means that the causes of crime is crucial for prevention. But a lot of people who I guess who works in policy prevention are quite uninterested or not interested in that issues. The situation of crime prevention, although it has some merits, has been really not a good development for prevention, because it fosters this idea that, which I know is even promoted in Sweden, that you should yourself go out and try to identify a problem, then you should yourself as a policy person try to find out what its causes is, and then you should try to find out how to do it. So basically it becomes an orientation where you say to practitioners that you find out what the problem is, you find out what the causes is, and you find out, which is obviously very difficult in a sense, without having any real support from that. I mean, you can see that in the Swedish Crime Prevention Council have done sort of books for local crime prevention. So basically are focused on one book focused on finding out what is the local problems. The second book is on what they call analysis of causes, which basically is saying that you should sit down, if you identify a problem, you should sit down with the other local people and try to find out why it happens, and then do something about it. Which I find quite interesting, because here you have a national crime prevention place where you think that was their job to try to help the local people or inform them about what might cause problems and so on. So I think that, again, as you started with saying, that this issue with theory, causation and so on has come a bit in the backwater. I mean, most people nowadays think they know what the causes are, even if there are hundreds of different ideas about it, which is a bit of a problem.
And perhaps even in the same line about the challenges, we talk about in many countries, criminology is in the law department, and you mentioned that you had to study sociology. But one thing that you have done in Cambridge also is open a little bit to, or not a little bit, open also to neurosciences, because Cambridge, you have Kyle Treiber, for example.
Yeah.
How did you arrive to this, to open your eyes to this, or I came quite late from.
So are you talking specifically what we do now?
Yeah.
How we became.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the sort of again kind of a coincidence, because I was, before Kyle emerged, I was interested in this dual idea with sort of the duality of thinking, sort of quick and so on, and had read on that, because when I was reading, as I said before, about the two minds idea, that interested in action theory, that was quite common in a sense, thinking fast, thinking slow, and that there were actually. So I was interested, but since I have no speciality in that, and then she turned up in Cambridge and did an MPhil. I think her original idea was just to do an MPhil and go home, but then she stayed on and did the PhD on this. I learned a lot about neuro stuff from her in terms of her work and so on. So she did the whole, and she's obviously specialized in that. So that's the link came in, and then eventually, as you know, she got the job as our neuropsychologist. So in that sense, which is quite good. So then she has also fostered some new people that are interested in this area. But here you can see another problem then. So one thing that still, which I hope that is good with Cambridge, is that it used to be the idea that we should have one psychologist, one sociologist, one lawyer, so post. And when I came, I was actually the sociology replacement for the guys, so that was the post. But now that has been vanished, this idea that we should have the various disciplines represented. But that is good for the cross-fertilization. But I guess it's a bit more it could be problematic if you are specialized in an area. But what a lot of people have done, as I understand, is that the institute has been like a hub. So let's say David Farrington work with a lot of people outside the institute, and Tony Bottoms. So people work with people, but the actual institute is kind of multidisciplinary in nature, but people still work. But I think, as I said, I think that's unfortunately seemed to vanish a bit. This basic idea that you should have that, because nowadays it's more specialized. So let's say when there's discussions, it's more like before you should have someone who is on psychology, sociology, law. Now it is, should we have someone who do human trafficking? So it's these very specific problems rather than the disciplines, or internet. We need someone who do internet and so on. And obviously there are hundreds of various things like that, so you cannot cover everything in that sense.
But was it easy for you to introduce in the institute someone from a completely different field? Because I have the impression that it's not so easy to convince our colleagues, no, or some of our colleagues.
No, I think it was fine. I'm not sure exactly what you mean, but I think it's fine, because at that point, I mean, if you differentiate the point when if you talk about the point when Kyle was appointed, I think it was Larry who was director. Larry is pretty open-minded and interested in stuff like that. He was very interested in thinking slow, thinking fast. I think he was not negative to have someone with a neuro. We used to have, as I said before, we had the sociologist, psychologist, psychiatrist, lawyer. So you could say in some sense it's also a replacement for a psychiatrist, but with a bit different orientation, I guess. But there is quite a big generational shift in Cambridge now, because most people are retiring. So Tony has retired, David has retired, Larry's retiring. Well, he still do so. I'm retiring. There's a lot of people who. So it's a new young generation.
But you retire, but you will continue. What are you going to do? Are you going to stay in Cambridge? Even if I know the idea is not to talk about the persons, but in this case.
I also have some contacts with Malmö, because a lot of my colleagues from before are now working in Malmö. So I have do something with Malmö. But then obviously the PAD study you can work on forever. We have so much data. So it's so I'm not, but the immediate idea is to stay on in Cambridge and then see, as you get older, see how life turns out. We never know.
Yeah.
You talked about one thing, which is, I think, also a key challenge of criminology. You mentioned the fact that people nowadays are tending to focus on very specific topics, for example, wildlife crime or internet crimes, radicalization online, and so on. I think this is a little bit problematic for the development of the field, and also with regard to policy, because people tend to reinvent the wheel and tend to try to apply new theories for each and every phenomenon. It can not possibly be the way to have some impact.
No, I think it's a very good point, Lewis, because also you find that in policy. I remember at the time when I worked at the Crime Prevention Council, we always got pressure that some kind of crime happened. You have to do a study about this crime. So, and I tried to argue that we should have a basic project about crime and causation, so interesting, that you could apply to problems rather than sort of. I mean, I specifically mentioned there was some parking attendants who stole coins from parking meters, and then they said, "Oh, you need to do a program. This such specific thing to do a study about that," and so on. So it's a bit the same problem as Lieven says, that if you focus on that, also in prevention, that you focus on very small things. And if you look at prevention, I think, and this is also linked to the popularity of situational crime prevention, is that the interest and in people's crime propensities and how you influence that is really going down. And I think you can reasonably argue that that is much more effective, because we know that most people most of the times don't do crime. We don't see crime as and then you don't need all these locks and so on. So it's not because they have a camera on a parking lot that I refrain from stealing a cars. I mean, I wouldn't steal it regardless if they have locks or and so on. So I think we are lacking a bit of that. Obviously, it might be slightly more controversial because it is about how do you affect people's values and norms and so on. But I think that's an important debate to have for future when it comes to policy. I mean, people get really scared when you talk about morality. So actually, one European colleague suggested to me that I should talk about norms instead. But it's basically the same thing. It's just that, and I just want to say that one of the major misunderstandings I think people get nervous about is that they think the argument is that people who do crime lack morality. That's not the argument. People have different moralities. Everyone has a morality. I mean, you can't be without a morality. So the question is understanding how come that people come to see, for instance, shooting a gang member is okay, or stealing pension fund money. Well, how does that emerge in the sense? But I guess morality is such a loaded word. So people always think that there is this virtue ethics that is a right, that if you talk about morality, you talk about that there is a right morality, but that's not necessary if you want to explain why people do as they do, which is more by having that. And people have different, as you know, views on that. I mean, think just about animal rights, vegans eating food and so on. People have different views, and that affects what they think about them. So it's not more difficult than that, I think.
I think people just often, make the naturalistic or moralistic fallacy or both. And I think this is bad because it hampers the influence criminology could have. You mentioned people tend to forget in prevention to focus on people's propensities. However, this is basically, very important for social prevention, because on the long run, if you want to have enduring changes, you need to talk about how to change people's views on things, and a lot of social prevention is about trying to influence how people think. So you can also influence how people think about what they should perceive.
But you have a good example, even in the sense that if you look at different crime categories, if you talk about things like partner violence, it's okay to talk about morality and say that people who assault the partners that they saw. If you talk about youth crimes, it's not okay. So it depends on if it talks about economic crimes, if you talk about insider trading and so on. If you talk about politicians who misbehave, it's okay in terms of morality. But for some sense, different kinds of crimes, sometimes the crimes should not be explained or have nothing to do, which I guess is unreasonable, because I don't know if you agree, but there's very different standards for when you can talk about morality depending on what crime category we talk about. War crimes, there's no one who talks about risk factors for people in war crimes and say that they did this because of A, B, and C.
These are very interesting examples, and maybe in some languages the words are more loaded than in others. For example, in French, the fact that the first statistics were called moral statistics, statistique morale, and people go in the wrong sense. You explained it very well, but some people may take it, as you said, in the wrong idea that this is what you should do. And,
if you think about it, I think morality or norms, whatever you want to call it, is a really good concept to integrate, because if you look at all kinds of disciplines, if you look at, let's say, neuropsychology, how rule making is important for us to work, look at social psychology, norms and rules are really important. Sociology, Durkheim and so on. So this idea that the rules or the norms we have and so on is really important runs through a lot of different disciplines. So it's a good starting point for, I think, for integrating insights from various perspectives. And also, as Lievens know from, since we have recently, even from evolutionary thinking.
Yeah, the combination of rules and moral emotions, I think, can be in an overarching umbrella to combine insights from different disciplines and to get a more integrated view on basic processes. It also helps you thinking in terms of proximate versus ultimate causes and mechanisms, and it would help criminology a lot, I think, because many theories which are applied to policy, be it social policy or situational crime prevention policy, are always based on these outdated views on human nature. And this is why many crime preventive initiatives may be doomed to fail, because, for example, many preventive initiatives start from the idea that people basically only do cost-benefit analysis in a monetary way or in a classic RCT, rational choice theory way, which is, of course, a simplification. But during many decades, people thought like this. And for classic control theory, people were defining selfishness in a way which was never meant to be defined in evolutionary theory. So I think sometimes new insights can change the way criminological theories think about human nature and social order. I think you also do this in situational action theory. Prevention, if criminologists want to have an impact on policy, preventive or rehabilitation, then they should, start with knowing how people work.
And also you have one problem which is problematic if you think about risk factor oriented or a lot of perspectives. They're very deterministic. I mean the issue of agency, that people actually have possibilities. I mean we all act within the constraints of our environments and so on, but within the constraints people have possibilities to make choices, and this is also important, I think, for understanding, because I mean even if you look at people in the worst of neighborhoods and people who live in the worst of conditions, most people who grow up in these kinds of areas do not develop serious criminality and so on. So we risk to have very simplistic ideas about what is going on. And if you want to prevent the real question, if you talk about sort of problematic areas or whatever you like to call them, it's obviously more common that people, we talk about youth crimes, who do serious crimes, comes from these areas, but most people who come from these areas do not do crime. So the really trick is to find out what differentiate these people, what differentiate the people who sort of goes on and develop from actually the majority who don't, even if they have very problematic and tough conditions and so on. So this is a problem I think that we have not paid enough attention to, which is again is important for policy and prevention, to so we do the right thing to help people.
Just because you mentioned this issue of the neighborhoods, there's a lot of discussions going on now about the youth criminality in Sweden, especially gangs. What do you think about that?
I mean, first of all, it's a relatively small group of people, but that they do obviously a lot of harm and so on, and then they really struggle because you can't really have people running around shooting each other, but and also because a lot of people are not involved, have started to get affected. Some people have got hit and so on when you shoot in and so on. But if you look at I think the history from the Chicago school onwards, I mean, the basic structure factor is never a good idea to concentrate people with a lot of different problems in the same neighborhood. That includes people who have mental problems, to people who have previous criminality, drug problems, but also people who who has just immigrated, that comes new to the country and don't know. If you mix all these people in the same area, and a lot of people in this, I think that the likelihood that environments that might be conducive to this, it's easier for them to rise. But still, we need to, I mean, you know, all the collective efficacy research and so on. So, which basically is a moral argument. It says that the social and moral climate of how people do rules and so on in that, how that actually emerged. But still, we don't really know why. Still, it's only a minority in these areas who get influenced. And you also have the part that people actually make choices. So some of them might actually, and if you think about this slippery slope kind of idea, that you could make some choices that is not so dramatic in the early, but then you get on a roll, and then suddenly you are involved in the gang and so on. But understanding all this, I think, would be really important for prevention and trying to do something about it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is we have a lot to think about, and I hope our listeners will be affected by our invitation to think about how criminology might change. You touched upon many interesting challenges. Any final ideas of how criminology can evolve in the future, or what would be good in a way to improve criminology in, for example, the UK and Sweden?
Yeah.
Based on your experience?
Well, it's difficult to say because, I mean, now since there, as you say, there are so many institutions and they are very different. But I think we talked about that to work to get some more coherent view of how people and places and so on work together, especially for in terms and perhaps a bit more interest in theory and the problem of causes, which I think also might be helpful for policy and prevention. And I just read read some Swedish sort of general governmental documents and so on. They typically say that crime is a complex problem with many causes, which is not helpful for anyone, is it? Because they run. And that's not just one document. Basically, all documents I read start off with saying that, and then they say to do something about crime, we must attack causes on various levels and involve various people. It's very unspecific. And I really like this old David Matza quote, which I've used sometimes, where he says we are in the hopeless position to argue that everything matters, because it is a bit like that, and that's why we probably have a need to work towards more integration of rather than more diversity in terms of development of various ideas.
So integration as a means to counter the over specialization, actually.
Yeah, no, and then you need to have a frame to do that, because that instead of people competing, sort of psychologists competing with sociologists and so on, you should really try to find out what various things can contribute to, but then you need to have some kind of frame to do that.
Well, I think that there's a lot of challenges awaiting policy. If you listen to the podcast, I can imagine that policymakers think, wow, it's even more difficult than we thought. I hope they will not become depressed and stimulate research.
But think about this. People start with the wrong questions. They start with asking, okay, well, what characteristics have offenders compared to others? What characteristics? Instead, starting with asking, why do people do crime? And simply saying that, yeah, they do crime because they think it's okay to do that in this situation. And then the next question will be, okay, so how come that people think, or some people think that this is okay? And then you work yourself up from that. I think you get better answers then and more focus on to answer the question. So then you come into, as you say, that is it because a sort of rational choice that we try to do, and that doesn't work really well, because most people don't do crimes or in a sense. So yeah, anyway.
It is a nice way of starting the discussion to think about that, and perhaps this just one last thing, because
Yeah.
as we're trying to take people from the same country, and one
Yeah.
common thing that I found, Henrik Tam mentioned that, but also Uberto Gatti mentioned from Italy, that when they started their careers, they are much older than you, at least 15 years,
Yeah.
I think, or maybe more. The typical person who was in jail was a poor person, and nowadays that is no longer the case of the persons who are in prison, and that is also perhaps why the theories need to be adapted. Have you experienced
Yeah.
a change in your career?
I don't know. I mean, that's a difficult question to ask, and that's probably difficult to answer, because in terms of doing the kinds of studies we do now, we didn't do at that time, so it's difficult to compare. But from a sort of a personal, which I think is interesting. I mean, when I started the criminology, and that's sort of the training, is that I was totally convinced that everything was about socioeconomic factors and so on and so on. And as the longer you work with that, you have to modify it. I mean, it's not unimportant, but it's not the sole importance to explain crime and so on. So you can see, we talked about that before. I think the importance of being able to change. You could say the stalemate now with all these theories and ideas that people just go to conferences. And I think what you said also, to go and listen to people who talk about something you don't naturally sort of come see as your interest, is probably a very good idea. It should be encouraged much more. Unfortunately, it looks to go the other way.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. Well, thank you very
long
much,
talk.
Joe. I mean, yeah, but it was very interesting, because I know there is something also in this connection, that distance, that creates also some sort of intimacy. I'm surprised by the effect that you can get. So it was really nice talking to you, and a lot of ideas. I mean, we have discussed quite a few times, but never such in deep. So I really appreciate it. I suppose Lieven too, but Lieven is more used to discuss with you, huh?
Yeah. No, we Lieven and I talk, but also, but Lieven, well, I will see you in Malaga, I guess.
Yeah, of course, both of us. So thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and let's keep in touch.
Thank you for following Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast. This podcast is edited by Eduardo Coco from the University of Lausanne. Our theme song is Seagull's Night, Noche de Gaviotas, composed by Gustavo Cantero, arranged by Tato Germano, and played by Tato and Gustavo with the voices of Sasha Conte and Alejandro Turco Gujot. Your host are Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium, and Marcelo Evi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. Cheers, and see you soon.